Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, in which three rabbis from Englewood, New Jersey, each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. This week we'll feature our once-a-month episode on relationships in the Parsha with my better half, my wife Shoshana, a teacher and school administrator for 20 years, who transitioned her career to become a social worker specializing in couples and individual therapy, all while serving as a dedicated rebbitzin. Next week we'll return to our regularly scheduled programming with your favorite rabbinic banter with Rabbi Akiva Block and Rabbi Daniel Goldberg. This week's episode of the One Pasuk podcast is proudly sponsored by Michal and Nady Fox in honor of Noam Fox and the opening of his new store, Play It Again Sports, this spring on Route 4 in Paramus. Buy new and used sports equipment for you and your children, and you can also sell your used equipment for cash or store credit. Noam is the third most important Chicago Cubs fan in Englewood, only behind his father and myself. His family are dedicated members of Kesher. His father, Nady, is a fellow Chicagoan, and his mother, Michal, maiden name Agus, grew up right here in Englewood, daughter of our own Marcel Agus and the late beloved Dr. Saul Agus of blessed memory. And I just have to point out that Play It Again Sports is the fulfillment of a pasuk in Koheles. It's right there. It's explicit. Koheles, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Tes, chapter 1 and verse 9. Ma shehaya hu sheyiyeh. What was will be again. Uma shena'asa hu sheyeyaseh. And that which has occurred will occur again. V'ein kol chadash tachas hashamesh. There is nothing new underneath the sun. And for sports equipment underneath the sun, you can find them at Play It Again Sports in Paramus. We wish Noam only mazel and success on this new and exciting business venture. You can follow him on Instagram at hashtag Play It Again Sports Paramus. Play It Again Sports, the very first corporate sponsor of the One Pasuk podcast. Thank you so much. We are so grateful for your support. Okay, we're back for our monthly installment of relationships in the Parsha. And the one pasuk that we will be discussing from Parshas Tzav, Perek Zayin, Pasuk Yud Beis, chapter 7, verse 12. Im al toda yakrivenu ve'yikriv al zevach hatoda chalos matzos bilulos bashamen. One who offers a thanksgiving offering together with the sacrifice of thanksgiving. So he brings matzos, these unleavened breads mixed with oil, urikike matzos mishuchim bashamen, and together with a different kind of bread, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and visoles murbeches chalos bilulos bashamen, and cakes of choice flour with oil mixed in, well soaked. So just to give you an image, the korban toda, the offering that we bring as thanksgiving on particular occasions, for particular reasons, is accompanied by several different kinds of breads, several different kinds of loaves, 40 in total. It's a lot of carbs that come with the korban toda. But Shoshana, what do you want to share on this pasuk?
So exactly as you just mentioned, our pasuk introduces us to the korban toda, which is an offering that is brought from a sense of overwhelming gratitude to Hashem. And there's a lot of debate as to whether this korban is voluntary or whether it's mandatory. Certainly, if we just read the psukim, we would get the impression that it's voluntary because the psukim don't tell us anything about who or when such a korban should be brought. If we look at the oral Torah, the Gemara seems to imply that this korban actually is mandatory, and it does so by listing 4 specific scenarios when the korban must be brought. I'm going to just list those very briefly. The first is somebody who travels the sea safely. The second is somebody who travels the desert safely. The third is somebody who is ill and has recovered. And the fourth is somebody who was imprisoned and is now released. What I'd like to draw your attention to is Rashi's comment on our pasuk, because Rashi paraphrases the Gemara. When I say paraphrase, what I mean is Rashi lists these 4 scenarios, but he lists them in a different order. Rashi takes scenario number 3, a person who was ill and recovered, and he moves it to position number 4. And when Rashi does something like this, he does so deliberately because he wants us to notice something that we might otherwise miss. And in this case, Rabbi David Foreman points out that Rashi wants us to notice that the way he groups the four, the first three fit together seamlessly, while the fourth, not so much. Think about the scenarios for a second. In the first three scenarios, the way Rashi has grouped them, somebody who traveled the sea safely, the desert safely, and was released from prison, all three scenarios present a situation where somebody was in a place of danger and they're no longer there. And as a result, they feel tremendous gratitude and they bring the korban. But what about the person who is ill? What about that person? True, they're in a better place. They're cured. They're feeling well. But the place that they were in, the place of danger, they're still very much in because that place was their own body. Even though they're healthy now, they're still living in a body that wasn't functioning well, that was ill, that they were fighting to cure. And in this way, that fourth scenario is so qualitatively different than the other three. What Rashi does here is sensitize us to the complexities that can arise for a person who recovers from illness. Something unique and different than recovering from other dangerous situations. For a person who recovers from illness, it's not always as simple as saying, that's behind me. I'm good now.
So it's interesting. I like the way you phrased it because you said that the person who is ill is in a different place, but we're using place differently. In the other cases, one is no longer in that physical space that was dangerous. But here, what's being highlighted is that the person is not in a different place. The person who has been healed is still in the same place physically that they were, but now they're in a different state of being, a different physical state of being, emotional, spiritual state of being, but they're not in a different location. And that's significant. That's what you're highlighting.
Exactly. And I think Rashi captures it also, and I'll explain it in more detail in a second, but just noticing Rashi's language, he captures it when he describes the four scenarios. He describes the first three with language that's plural. He says, Yordei Hayam, Holche Midbarot, Chavushe Beit Asurim. And then when it comes to the person who's ill, it's Chole Shenit Rapeh. A person can feel distinctly alone or lonely when the recovery that they're going through is within their own body, in their own being, even after they're recovered. And this is not only physical illness, it's mental illness. It's anything that a person contends with in their own body. It is so qualitatively different. And it's a subtle, not often discussed topic, but one that I think we can become much more sensitive to. Certainly, in our day and age.
So I want to push back just a little bit, but I think it'll ultimately clarify because I think still somebody who was sick went through a certain experience, just like the other three. And the other three experience that danger very personally, and they feel unsafe, whether in the desert, on the sea, or in prison. But the idea is that they're no longer in that state of danger. Where that danger was experienced is still present. Meaning a person who has survived going through the desert is no longer in the desert, is no longer exposed to the desert, and the same thing for the sea, and the same thing for prison. But someone who has been cured of illness, there's a certain separation that doesn't happen like it does in the other cases, where you're still you, and you haven't been moved away or dislocated from that place of danger. You're still in the same place.
I think you captured exactly what I'm trying to highlight. And I think if I could add a little more Torah to this korban, the way that we bring this korban highlights exactly what you just said. Because again, you mentioned at the beginning that we bring this korban with 40 loaves of bread, lots of carbs. But what's distinct about this korban is that the bread consists of both bread as well as matzah, which is so unique, right? Bread characteristically represents strength, and matzah more humility, right? There's a nuanced complexity here in bringing this korban for some of these scenarios. It's also in the way that we mark the celebration. The korban's supposed to be brought with a minyan. We're supposed to publicize the recovery. We're supposed to do this publicly. But we can't allow the celebration to last more than a day and an evening because the person in recovery may not be ready for a full-on celebration. There's so much nuance here that goes into recovering from something that happens in your body, in your being, than what would happen if you were experiencing something external from oneself. And again, I think you're making an excellent point. I'm not trying to minimize those other experiences. I'm just trying to sensitize us specifically to the ones that go on in our body. And that's the distinction.
It reminds me of something that I articulate when people, unfortunately, are sitting Shiva, and that is that one of the Nihuge Avelos, one of the mourning practices that we observe when we sit Shiva, is that the mourner is not supposed to leave the house. They're supposed to stay at home. It's not just that they're sitting receiving visitors. No, they're not supposed to leave their house. They're supposed to stay in their house. And what I try to highlight for people is that the rabbis were sensitive to the fact that the mourner's pain is very personal. Nobody knows the pain like the mourner themselves. And when someone is suffering pain so unique and so personal, it's isolating, right? You feel different than the rest of the world that's just going on about its business. And so the rabbis create this space for a person who feels isolated, who naturally withdraws from the community and says, okay, yes, you can withdraw. And we're going to protect that space for you. You're going to stay home for a week. And it's up to the community to be in your space, both physically as well as emotionally and spiritually, to the extent that we can. And I think similarly, when it comes to someone who is suffering illness, they receive enormous comfort from people, but their pain is their pain, and their discomfort and their suffering is all their own, and nobody can feel it for them. And so it's a very, very personal experience. And so I really see this nuance in the Rashi, how the chola is distinguished, is put almost in a subcategory of its own, but also reminds me of the fact that the Korban Toda, and this may be a little bit different than what you were just saying, but the Korban Toda, with this plethora of breads, 40 in total, is meant to encourage the person who brings the Korban Toda to share his joy with others and invite others into his gratitude. And so obviously for every person bringing a Korban Toda, that, how they feel gratitude and how they step back into the world obviously depends on their experience and their needs. But fundamentally, I think you have that same journey that the rabbis envisioned for the mourner who emerges from Shiva and takes a walk around the block, that they emerge from their solitude to whatever extent. The same thing for the Chola, the person who is sick, there's a certain solitude. And when, Baruch Hashem, they are able to experience recovery, there's a recognition of that solitude and a recognition of it by way of the fact that we also want you to connect with others and share this bread of Thanksgiving with others.
I would capture what you just said by saying we need to celebrate with sensitivity and check in on that person even after the celebration ends. Follow up with that person a week later, a month later, 6 months later. I cannot tell you how much it means, even if the person is 10 toes on the ground, grounded, to hear from somebody else that they're sensitive to knowing that it could be otherwise is so deeply meaningful.
When you say celebrate with sensitivity, it sounds like you're responding to something. It sounds like you're responding to something perhaps from experience or from your work as a therapist. Maybe you could just spell out concretely what you're thinking about. What is it that people should be aware of to avoid?
Yeah, this is what happens when you do a podcast with your spouse and you say something a little bit cryptically and they see right through you and call you out on it. But I'm glad you did because you're absolutely right. I think you hit 2 out of 3 of the nails on the head. Certainly from personal experience, certainly from my experience working as a therapist, but also just my experience living in a community and functioning as a human being, being the recipient of friendship, hopefully being a good friend, and recognizing that a lot of the platforms that are publicized today, whether they're videos or podcasts, represent and present celebration very much in a linear fashion, in a before and after. It was, it is. It seems extremely celebratory, missing a lot of nuance. And I do have somewhat of a visceral reaction when I see that because I think of all the people watching and listening who are not having that lived experience. And they second guess themselves and they ask themselves, am I messed up? Am I broken? Is there something wrong with me? And the answer is no. We've just chosen to publicize things in a really linear way. And I don't think it's a fair representation of the vast majority of how people recover and then flow through different aspects of the post recovery.
Maybe just to be a little more concrete, I think what you're referring to is what we often see either on social media or elsewhere, where recovery is often framed as a victory, a hero story, one in which the subject is able to express unbridled joy and gratitude. It's just all positive feelings. And very often, those feelings can be accompanied by some ambivalence based on different aspects of the trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a great podcast I highly recommend. Kate Bowler's podcast, Everything Happens. She had on a guest probably a year ago who talked in such a profound and humble and sensitive. She really wasn't looking to put people down, but just try to deepen people's understanding. She talked about this slogan that has become bumper stickers of I beat cancer. And she talks about what does that even mean? What kind of cancer did you have? What does it mean to beat it? There's so much nuance in recovery that we can do better at representing and being sensitive to, even as we celebrate. And we should. It's a Korban Toda. We're supposed to celebrate the recovery, but not in a linear black and white fashion so that other people feel marginalized by those celebrations. Sometimes even the person themselves who is being celebrated may feel an aspect or two of that. And we can do this better. We absolutely can.
It's interesting. While you were talking, I was looking up online what are some of the typical challenges that people who recover from serious illness face. And of course, it mentions PTSD as well as anxiety, depression, fear of recurrence. But there's one other thing that's mentioned, and that is a shattered or altered sense of identity, that these experiences can change a person. And sometimes those changes, they're not necessarily positive, like, oh, now they cherish life. Sometimes, and they're not necessarily negative, but they're different. And because they're different, because that sense of identity is different, it's a little disorienting.
All four scenarios that the Gemara lists are going to change people. No question about it. When it happens in your body, in your psyche, it changes you even more. It's qualitatively different. And that's exactly what you're pointing out.
Actually, I want to go back to what you were just saying because I think there's I think there's a helpful metaphor, and that is you mentioned those other scenarios which you described as external, and it really is. A person can experience crisis or challenge in a way that's a little bit separated from them. But this is an intrusion. This is your own body. These are your own cells, your own DNA that are not functioning. You think about people who face challenges with their immune system, right? Their own immune system is attacking healthy cells on an emotional, spiritual level. That's very jarring.
That word intrusion is so profound. It's a battle self against self. And that's exactly what you captured by saying an intrusion. That's exactly correct. And it's so hard on so many different levels.
And I know it's going to sound like a cliche, but it just reinforces the fact that the most important thing to keep in mind is to just be there for the person. While they're reckoning with their recovery and how this has changed their lives, the temptation is to talk them through it or what have you. But again, because it's so internal, it just means that it's that much more important to just be there. Just be there so that they feel your presence.
And I think just being there, I've said this before, I'll say it again, is a lot of permission seeking. It's not silly and it's deeply appreciated. Would it be okay if? Would it be okay if?
Can you spell that out a little more concretely for the uninitiated? What permission seeking?
Permission seeking, whenever you're playing a supportive role for somebody else, ask, would you like it if? Would it be okay if? You can even take one step more removed and say, would it be okay if I asked you about? Would it be okay if I raised the topic of? Permission seeking. It sometimes can feel silly when you're doing it. It is so, so deeply appreciated. It gives the person going through the hardship the ability to set the stage for what they need.
There was something else sitting in the back of my mind that your last comments just finally brought out. And that is when we have a discussion like this, which is really deep and intense and focusing on things that are very real in our human experience, I want to caution people that this isn't something that you're supposed to be meditating on all the time. And it's not something that you should, okay, now I have to be on guard. No, what it is to listen to a conversation like this, to have a conversation like this, is to spend a few minutes thinking about something so that gradually it becomes part of the way that we interact with people. It's not like you listen to a podcast like this and say, okay, now I have to do this. It doesn't work like that. We're all human beings who are constantly growing, and having a discussion like this is something that just adds to that journey, but it's not like this is like a set of instructions that have to be followed.
Al levavchem. Listening to a podcast like this, hear it, let it sit on your heart, and when the moment is right, it will become more of secondary nature.
Olive Avecha is such a beautiful idea. You got to tell people the whole idea. So
What one of my favorite divrei Torah from the Kutzker, what's the pasuk in Shema?
V'hayu hadvarim eile asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al livavecha. And these ideas, these mitzvos from the Kriya Shema that I'm commanding you shall be on your heart.
And the obvious question is, why don't we say it should be in your heart? Why al? Why on? And the Kutzker says, because so much of what we learn and we hear sits on the heart. We cannot possibly expect ourselves to integrate everything that we learn all the time. It's unrealistic, it's not human. But let it sit on the heart. And when we have those moments where the heart is open, those teachings, they seep in, they become us. Most of the time, our goal is to pailaman, al, and they will become us in those moments when our hearts open.
Beautiful. Have a great Shabbos.